Hello, this is Reverend Don Lewis coming to you from beautiful Danville in uh, the homeland of the Corellian tradition. And this is Midday with Reverend Don. And welcome. And as you know, if you follow Midday with Reverend Don, you can communicate with me directly by typing your questions or comments into whatever page you happen to be watching the program on, and they will appear here in my chat room and we can talk directly. And I'd love to have that direct communication with you. As you may remember yesterday, we were talking about education, and in particular, education for the young. You know, it's a famous saying by the Jesuits that if you have the first 7 years of a person's life, you have them forever. And this was a cornerstone of their educational philosophy. But there is a certain truth in this, perhaps not universal, but very broad, that if you can influence how a person thinks in the first 7 years of their life, they're probably not going to turn from that. And that means, among other things, that even if they find better ways later, they may have a great deal of difficulty adapting them. So this is why, when we talk about education, I think it's so very important that we talk about critical thinking skills right at the very beginning. Because if you learn how to think critically right at the start of your life, you will always have that ability. It is very hard for someone who knows how to think critically to simply stop. Whereas it's not also very hard for someone who doesn't know how to think critically to start. And it's certainly possible in both cases, but if you can get people thinking critically from the beginning of their lives, they're going to do much better. And one of the reasons for that, we talked about this yesterday, is that it isn't really the person who has the answers who's in the best position, but the person who knows what the right questions are. And that comes from critical thinking. Because if you know what the right questions are, you can always find the answers. And you will have the reasoning skill to be able to tell a good answer from a bad one. So those are some of the aspects of why critical thinking is very important. And, you know, people who don't understand critical thinking don't understand really why it's such a thing. Critical thinking is the ability to look at a story and say, oh, that doesn't make any sense. If we look at certain things in the political world in recent years, and hello to Ravenwolf in the chat room, it's good to see you, Ravenwolf. Some of the stories that you will see in media, for example, at first sight may be compelling, but then you look at them and you say, well, but this doesn't make any sense. There are parts of the story that are missing. There are parts that are not well presented. And if you have critical thinking skills, you'll see that. But if you don't, you may be simply caught up in the emotion of it all. And hello to Tom in the chat room. It's good to see you, Tom. And emotion is a very good way of selling something. But it's not necessarily the best way of understanding it. Certainly, we don't want to exile ourselves from our emotions. We don't want to repress our emotions. We don't want to not pay attention to them. But when it comes to understanding things, that's what our mind is for. And Ravenwolf says, because when we do this, we replace real news with quick 2 seconds of shock and awe to mindless zombies. And well, yeah, that's kind of it, actually. And you know, it goes back to, well, probably as long as there's been media, and the idea that what bleeds leads. This isn't really a good way to get your news. It's not a good way to understand what's actually happening in the world. When it comes to understanding what's happening in the world, you need to be able to look at it from a non-emotional perspective. Now, that's not to say that an emotional subject will not stir up your emotions, but it is to say that's not how you understand it. You need to understand what's going on. When we come back to the idea of education, we were talking yesterday about how one of the big questions will be, what are we including in that education? But one thing that, in my opinion, cannot really be regarded as negotiable is how to think. How um, to ask those right questions, how to tell the difference between an actual answer and an emotional proposition. Um, how to, well, how to tell if it's bigger than a bread box, to borrow an example from yesterday's discussion. Um, in the old game where you try to guess something by its characteristics, one of the early questions for most people was, is it larger than a bread box? Because it told you roughly the size that you were looking for. Because a bread box, if you don't know, is like 1 by 2 feet, more or less. And hello to Janet in the chat room. It's good to see you, Janet. And you knew that if what you were looking for was smaller than that, it certainly limited what you were looking for. And if it was larger, it limited it also. And then you could ask more questions. But asking those questions, considering how those things looked, what qualified as their characteristics, was a very good exercise. So if we're talking about putting together education, I think for people of any age, but especially for children, I think that we need to really be looking at critical thinking skills. And one of the problems with that, of course, is that so few of us actually have them. It has not been something, certainly, that public education, and at least in this country, has been particularly devoted to teaching its students how to do. We see that all too clearly in the world around us today. My parents made a point to teach me some of these things and to teach me other things. I went to public schools, but my education was not solely dependent on them. And I was talking yesterday also. So I guess our conversation today really is starting again with talking about children and what might be good in an education system directed at children. When I was a child, my mother read me as goodnight stories, bedtime stories, things that for most people would have been considered adult. She read me Egyptian mythology, the story of Isis and Osiris, for example, I remember very particularly. There were many others that she would read. She also, at certain points, read from the Iliad, which, I'm not entirely sure what I was getting from the Iliad when I was that age, but certainly the cadence of the poetry, just by itself, was a valuable thing to learn. And I don't think we went through the whole Iliad, because for one thing, I don't think my mother would have considered that particularly good for a small child, but we went through quite a bit of it. One that I remember in particular was The Pilgrim's Progress. My father had a very old copy of that book, beautifully illustrated. My attention was caught by the illustrations. It was probably 1880s, beautiful black and white illustrations, and I wanted my mother to read that as a bedtime story. And my mother, who knew what this story was about, really didn't initially want to do that. And my father, who did not normally win conversations with my mother, but he did on this occasion, pointed out that for me, the moral aspect of this story would have no relevance whatsoever. It was just an adventure story to me. And if you're not familiar with The Pilgrim's Progress, a variety of moral characters are portrayed as if they were human beings. And they go through their adventures as a moral exemplar for a Christian world, which is why my mother did not originally want to read it. But when you take that out of it and just look at it as, oh, this bunch of adventurers is going through this weird little fairyland, Well, at that point, she decided it was fine, and we read quite a bit of it, um, including with its 19th century language. And, I think things like that are very beneficial. Um, and Ravenwolf says, was that the art book with the large sack on his bag as well? I'm not certain. It's been too long now, but it may very well have been. Um, but my mother did not consider it necessary to be reading children's books exclusively to me for my education, and I think that's one reason that I came out with a good education. I can understand things from earlier eras, and part of the reason for that also is when I learned to read for myself, I was not either just I was neither discouraged from going to older books, and I was already encouraged to be looking at them. And plus, my parents' library included a lot of older books. Um, I remember thinking when I was around 12 that I understood early modern English better than contemporary English, which may very well have been true at that point. And I could speak in early modern English just as well as in contemporary English, and I don't know that there's anything wrong with that. One of the things about early modern English is just how creative it was. It was a period of renaissance for the English language, and all kinds of new things were being invented and played with in the language. Whereas right now it seems like people are trying to downplay the language, to restrict it and hold it back, which I think is a terrible, terrible thing. I think that the various different grammar helpers that we have now on computer can be helpful if you don't assume they universally know what they're talking about. But the way they're trying to restrict the way people use languages, I think, is almost scandalous. I don't know how many times I've put in a perfectly cromulent English sentence and had it come back saying, you might want to consider more concise language to make this more understandable for your users, or for your readers, which makes me wonder, what level of comprehension do they think my readers have? Um, it's there's something to be said for grace in language and a lot to be said for creativity in language. One of the things that makes the English language, or that made it such a great language internationally, it wasn't British imperialism, although that certainly didn't stop it. But it was the fact that the English language had so many borrowed words that it could be used to describe things that were very hard to describe in some other languages. And it was continuing to borrow words and still does today. Sometimes to considerable questions about how some of them perhaps might be used, like the plural of octopus, which people today love to say is properly octopodes. But I would argue that no, they were right when they said it was octopi, because it didn't, although it's a Greek word, they brought it out of Latin, not out of Greek. And so for 100 years, they used the Latin plural with no question. But when you're bringing words from many different languages, of course, you're going to have that kind of question, and sometimes the answer may change. I remember seeing something online that was also rather shocking to me. There's apparently an attempt by certain people to try to remove all the loan words from the English language and use only what is absolutely Germanic in the language, which I think is the most backward thinking way of approaching language that I can imagine. Because again, the thing that made English so usable was the wide range of ways you can say things, the number of things you can say. Cutting that down is not a good idea. It reminds me of when the Scandinavians decided they needed to simplify their runes. They created staveless runes, which lasted for a little while, but not very long, because nobody could read them. If you've ever seen staveless runes, you have trouble telling which one is which and one from another, it was not a good idea. And so they then had to create new runes to replace what they had in the first place because they'd oversimplified it. Not the thing to do. And I think that we need to be careful of doing that in the modern English language. Now, as we were saying yesterday, I think that multilingual education is very important. It's important for a number of reasons. Some of them in the past, some of them in the future. And some of them simply to be able to move around. You know, one of the things about the late 20th century is that many places in the world that you might go, if you're an English speaker, you'll find people already speak English. But is that going to be true in 20 years from now? I don't know that it is. I think that it's simply a matter of self-preservation for the next generation to be more multilingual. It also does speak to how different languages are used in different ways. I've been talking about how English is, well, probably still the dominant international language in the Western world. And one of the reasons is that it is so adaptable. So you can say so many things and you can say them so much faster. And if you doubt that, take a look at how something is said in Spanish or Greek or French, and then compare it to how you can say it in English. And although it's possible to use just as many words if you want to speak in a more old-fashioned sort of way, in many cases, English can say the same things with half as many words. This is very helpful for a lot of things in the business world, not necessarily in the creative world, but in the business world. And it's one of the reasons that English became a dominant language. But at the same time, if you want to work with technology, you really do better to also know how to speak German. German is the international technological language because it can address so many things in technology much more easily than English can. And that has to do with how words are formed in German. In particular with how you put different words together to make new ones, which are very good for technological processes. To be able to speak both of these, I think gives you a leg up. I personally am still a great believer in being able to speak Latin because so many things in medicine still rely on Latin and Greek to some extent. One of the things I really hate is the use of alphabet soup in medications. So many things or medications and diseases and the like, they want to have this string of alphabet letters rather than tell you the name of the disease. If you speak Latin or Greek even a little bit, you can figure out what that name of that disease actually means. The word pulmonary has a very particular meaning. The word cardiac has a very particular meaning. The word things like hypertension, they have a very particular meaning. If you know what that meaning is and you know the name of your disease, and in some cases of the medications that go with it, you don't need someone to explain it to you. You know where to start. But if it's just a bunch of letters, someone has to explain that to you. That's a power technique. That prevents you from being able to decipher it yourself and means you have to go to them as the expert to tell you what it means. And while that seems like a small thing on the surface, stop and think how many times you've read about people in certain parts of the medical profession not listening to their patients, and not explaining things well to their patients who don't know what to ask because all they've got are these letters to work with. I think this is something that is a very bad idea. I think it would be much better if more people understood how to simply understand the names. This is true also in science. The more you can understand what you're looking at, the less you need someone else to explain it. So when we talk about, and Angelina says, thank you for speaking on this. Thank you, Angelina. Obviously, it's something that has importance to me. But, you know, when we look at education for young people, that's the best time to have this in. They say that you can learn languages best as a child. And I think that's undoubtedly true because your mind is still growing and you know you haven't well actually tell you the truth. There's no language you've completely learned at any point in your time on this earth, in all likelihood, because all of them are larger than what one person will know. But by the time you're in your 20s, at least, you mostly have a pretty good um, angle on the language that you primarily speak. And whether it's because you simply cannot learn others as easily after that, or because you're out of the habit, either way, people usually don't. It's best to do it earlier in life. But I think that if you've learned more than one at different points in that early part of life, that it will still be easier for you later. Um, and, you know, there are so many things. Language is a very fascinating subject, and I've talked about it more than once, probably more than anyone really wants to hear. I've talked about the bugaboo of pronunciation um, and why people should worry less about that. There's a particular person whose media I've started watching lately who is all about expanding vocabulary. But one thing she does that I'm not as fond of is that she'll speak to how to properly pronounce the words and not be right. She's right for a certain accent, but she doesn't seem to be aware that there are other accents, even in just American English, and that different ways of pronouncing things, depending on the dialect that you're speaking, are not wrong. They're the dialect that you're speaking. And that's also, I think, a very important thing. I think that I think I've watched people really make things harder for themselves in life by focusing on non-essentials, like how to pronounce words rather than what the word means. I've talked before about how some people get very concerned with how to properly pronounce the names of ancient deities, often in languages whose proper pronunciation we don't even know. If I had $1 for every time someone has told me that ISIS should be pronounced Auzet, I'd have a lot of dollars. And I have to tell you, speaking from a linguistic point of view, Auzet has not been considered an appropriate translation of ISIS for at least 50 years. There is not a single translation, but Auzet is pretty much gone. Aset is still sometimes used. Iset is more common. Ise is very common. The one thing we don't know is how they pronounced it. ISIS actually is as close as we have to someone having written down how Egyptians pronounced it, because the Greeks were sitting right there listening to Egyptians pronounce it. And whether they were pronouncing it Ise, and then they added the S for a better Greek use, or whether it was Izet, and the S was the closest they could come to it, or whether that T, maybe there was a little bit more of a slurred sound than we give it credit for. These are all possibilities. This is also true in so many other things in life. It's more important to pay attention to what the word means. I once had someone get very upset with me for mispronouncing the word geomancy, because they were certain that it was actually geomancy. I've got to tell you, in the English language, geomancy is not the pronunciation. The pronunciation is geomancy, just as you would say well, it's like any other Greek word you bring into English, and you would say, for example, biology, not biology. So you would say geomancy, or you would say geomancy, not geomancy, because that's just how the English language works. And but having said that, that doesn't necessarily mean there's anything terribly wrong with saying the other one, or any of various ones. It's much better that you understand the word. I'm not going to say I never messed them up or that I might not have just messed them up right then. But I know what geomancy is. I know what what arithmancy is. I know what numerology is. I know what isopsophy is. And if I didn't happen to be pronouncing them entirely correctly, that's far less important than knowing what they are. So that too is something that I think we need to avoid when we talk about education, particularly for young people, which is pedantry. Um, we need to focus instead on practicality. What do they need to know? What is actually helpful? And is it actually helpful? Lady Crystal, um, among different people that she studied with, at one point studied with Sun Bear and the Sun Bear tribe. And I remember there was a time in the 1980s when her landline phone was not working for some reason. And so she decided to do energetic healing on it, which, if I remember correctly, actually worked. But one of the points that she made in convincing me to work with her on this was that, to borrow a phrase from Sun Bear, if it doesn't help you grow corn, why are you doing it? If it is not, if it's not going to help you with the practical things you need to be doing in life, does it have a value? Now, sometimes the answer to that might be yes, but it's worth looking at. And, one of the things we sometimes talk about in ancient religion, the Romans were in the habit of covering their heads for religious worship. In caput velato, to be a veiled head in approaching the altar. The Greeks, on the other hand, were completely different. They unveiled their heads for religious worship. So if you ask me, and the Egyptians also did not veil their heads, it therefore may be a value in Roman worship, but it's not of value elsewhere because nobody else needed to do it. And I don't believe for a moment that they were not having good reactions from their worship. So I think that looking at practical issues is important. So, and Janet says, thank you for the bit on geomancy. And says, yeah, I've been saying it wrong. This goes back to how English takes words from so many languages. A lot of the languages that English takes words from would give you pronunciation geomancy, because putting the accent on that second to last syllable is the case from some languages, but not from Greek. But having said that, it's not something to be worried about either, in my opinion. And I think we started this program talking about critical thinking skills. A very important part of critical thinking skills is knowing what you really should be worried about and what you don't need to be worried about. And I think we'll close that there, because I see we've come to the end of our half hour. We'll be talking about this same situation, the same subject tomorrow. I don't know what we'll be saying, but we'll be saying something. And so I will look forward to seeing you then. Thank you all for being here. It's always lovely to see you. And until next time, let us close with our prayer. Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you for all that you do for us in our lives. And we ask you to continue to be with us and to help us to know those things that are important in our lives. Help us to make wise decisions and move forward with those decisions in practical ways, and to move forward in good and positive directions. Beloved Mother Goddess, beloved Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you with great love and thanks, and knowing you are always with us, but from respect, we thank you for your presence, and may you be blessed now and always. And I thank you for your presence, and may you be blessed now and always, and I will see you tomorrow.